everyone. Welcome to the Cosmic Matrix podcast. I'm Laura Matsu, and I'm here with my partner, Bernhard Gunther. And this podcast is primarily about esoteric spirituality, psychology, self-work. If you're new to the podcast, we also have websites where we both write about these topics as well. And so this episode in particular is going to be about relationships and spiritual growth. So how can we not use relationships, but how can we have relationships in our lives that can contribute to our spiritual growth? And what does that even mean? And, talking about, can we do spiritual work with someone who isn't committed to doing the work as well? Also the barriers to using relationships for spiritual work, also people who kind of try to enforce a conscious relationship. But most importantly, we're also going to talk about the foundation of the relationship, which really we feel through our own experiences has to be centered around the divine. Otherwise, you tend to use the other partner as a source of your happiness. And as always on this podcast, we have a second hour available for the members of the Veil of the Reality Forum. And on that hour, we're going to get into deeper topics like healing trauma and relationships. We're also going to talk about our past before we met, including past relationships and important lessons we had to learn. And also occult forces is a really popular topic we talk about on this podcast quite often, and how they can interfere in the relationships that want to be birthed onto this planet currently. So, to begin, let's just discuss it. Relationships as a path to spiritual growth. How can we use a relationship as a path to spiritual growth?
Well, that, would probably imply what does spiritual growth mean, right? Spirituality, engaging in spiritual work. And, classic spiritual work is yoga. Yoga, and we're not talking about that as just a asana practice or like a physical workout, but yoga meaning union with the divine. So spiritual work to aspire to something higher, right? To source, to God, to the divine, to self-realize your true nature of being. And, that also implies to clear our being, clear our vessel, and heal our wounds and traumas for the divine force to anchor itself. And, get out of the illusion of the ego personality, the illusion of separation, and, essentially even transcending duality and all of that. But this process is obviously very different or very unique to each individual. Right? It's even unique to each individual within the relationship. So when we talk about spiritual work in context of the relationship, I think the first thing to talk about is how sincere is each person engaged in the work themselves, right? And again, what do you mean by spiritual work? To really, use practices to pierce behind your ego personality. And, nowadays, what comes to me with spiritual work, we're a multidimensional being, it's such a multidisciplinary approach. Right. So because we don't want to fall into the trap of spiritual bypassing, of just meditating. Or
spiritual materialism.
Meaning meaning to jump from teaching to teaching, to just look for the next high, right, and whatnot.
Yeah.
But it implies, also a lot of just basic psychotherapeutic work, psychological work, childhood wounding work, shadow work, trauma work, and all of that to clear the vessel, to come more in tune with our true essence, to connect to essence. That's basically what spiritual work is about.
Yeah, and I find that for myself, it's basically rooted in a daily practice. So it started out with me with yoga asana practice, which helped me get into my body and release some of the stuff that I was holding on to. And then it really evolved into more meditation practice. But then I've noticed, so you could I feel John Welwood talks about this in his book, Psychology of Awakening, which we might have mentioned on another podcast, is that Westerners need a combination of both spiritual work and psychological work, because we have all these issues that they don't really have in the East, or even in South America where we work with shamans. Like, we go down there with our complex psychological issues, and they're like, oh, you just need to do more ayahuasca. I don't know what your problem is. Like, you try and tell them about your childhood trauma and they don't get it, because we have a unique set of issues. And so what I've found, what I look for, at least when I'm working with people one-on-one, is I know that they're committed if they have committed to their daily spiritual practice, which, by the way, can be anything, doesn't necessarily have to be meditation. And we've got into that in other podcasts. I also feel some people aren't ready for meditation, but something, maybe it's even just walking in nature. And then also what comes up in that practice. So maybe, you're constantly coming up against your own anger, your own fear, then finding out the source of that and working with it on a psychological level. So otherwise, I've noticed, and I know because I was doing this for a long time, you could meditate over and over and be faced with the same problems over and over, and you don't really get anywhere. So you need to combine it with the spiritual work so you can have the practical tools for dealing with basically what comes up in your practice.
Exactly. So now, what does it mean in context of a relationship, spiritual growth and relationship? Well, it means, the question to be asked is, what is the relationship based on, or what is the intention of the relationship? So, we all, like humanity, is very much influenced or conditioned or programmed by this very overly romantic image of relationship we see in Hollywood movies, and there's just love and bliss and excitement and hot sex and just, just happiness and joy all the time, and there are no issues and whatnot, and both partners fulfill each other and they have the greatest time. But a relationship, a spiritual relationship, also based on growth, entails that both people need to be committed to growth. Mm-hmm. And that's really the foundation, to really can I grow with this person? That's the question to be asked. Can I really, open myself, my vulnerability to show myself who I truly am without needing to pretend, so much in romantic relationships, especially you see this when people first engage in a relationship, both sexes, whatever it may be, they try to impress the other person.
Yeah.
And mostly become very inauthentic in that sense, right? And, get distracted by the romantic feeling of just emotional highs, sexual highs and all of that. And then later on, usually the shadow comes up, and then people, see that as the attraction fades. That's okay. I'm not in love with this person anymore. It was the wrong decision, so to speak. We need to break up. When that is actually there's actually an opportunity, right? And if you're with the right person, meaning both people are committed to this growth, right? And using the relationship as a mirror for their own stuff. And growth also implies conflict. So it also, what it also implies, so to speak, is how we're dealing with conflict when these things come up, because any growth also implies to get out of our comfort zone. So again, going back to spirituality and conscious relationship, or using relationships for spiritual growth, the foundation for both partners need to be that both are committed, that sincerity, committed to each other and committed to the growth of the relationship.
Yeah. And you see that a lot. I'm sure you deal with, I know you deal with clients, every day who, we see them at the retreat as well. By the way, we have a couple of spots open for our retreat coming up. But yeah, when one partner is committed to this growth and the other isn't, then what I feel it really comes down to, what is that person who's in the relationship more committed to? Are they truly committed to growth? Are they truly committed to security? Because if you're truly committed to growth and you're with someone who isn't also committed to growth, then if you choose them, ultimately you're choosing the security of the relationship and you're not choosing growth, I feel. And that can be a very difficult choice to make as well, because, we're in relationships for a really long time. We have attachments to these people, and ultimately it would take a lot of courage to let go of these safe relationships and step into the unknown. But if we're really truly committed to growth, sometimes, there will come a point where we'll have to take that step. And I see that time and time again, with a lot of my friends and people I work with, is that they're in a relationship with someone who isn't committed to growth. And so all the work that they do is it's almost like they're overcompensating for the work that their partner isn't doing. They're holding the relationship together through the work that they do. Or another thing I see is really common is a partner gets threatened by them changing, and then consciously or subconsciously tries to, it's almost like they're an Agent Smith, which is like an interference in their growth and tries to keep them down at their level. I know I've experienced that actually as well.
Because it all comes down to when the relationship was formed, the first attraction, people got together. What is it based on, right? And most often what for the most part, when we get attraction on the person, there are a lot of unconscious drives that attract us to another person and why this other person is attracted to us, which we are not necessarily aware of at all. And most often what people think was actually a love, romantic attraction could actually be related to wound bonding, right? Yeah. It's like their pathologies match or their neuroses match, which is actually fine. There's nothing quote unquote wrong with it if you're aware of it and then can use that in the relationship as a catalyst to heal these issues that come up naturally, because, you can, from a spiritual perspective, actually, it is even from the Gurdjieff work, or esoteric Christianity, they talk about the fifth way, the way of the polar couple, of how actually a conscious relationship and using a relationship as a catalyst for growth, for spiritual growth, can literally catalyze each individual's spiritual development. Because, way more comes up in an intimate relationship, obviously. But again, going back, what is the relationship based on? And like you shared, I've also worked with many people, especially in this day and age, in the relationship, one partner is quote unquote waking up, right? And starting engaging in the work and learning and working on themselves, but the other person is not, right? And so many times people ask me then, what can I do to make him or her also engage in the work? And then these unhealthy dynamics happen, and also this misplaced hope, like, oh, sometimes in the future I think he will get it and then, or she will get it. And, I just, he's a nice guy. It's like it's putting up with a lot of excuses, right? Yeah. And I'm not saying that people might not change, but you need to be very careful of esoteric laws, spiritual laws that you cannot give until it's asked for. If somebody wants to stay asleep, not do the work, you need to respect that free will of the person, respect the ignorance. You cannot make people do anything. If you do it and people do it just because you say so, over time, that will come back around, build resentment, and it's not based on true sincerity, right?
Exactly.
I mean, I've had sometimes people, couples booking sessions for me, coming with me, where one partner was literally dragging the other person here to do a session, right? And even like working on HK session or holographic kinetics and or just doing, couple therapy, but the other person really didn't want to be here. And even a moment, I need to also honor my own integrity and understanding that I can only help people so much as they're willing to help themselves, right? So even in the instances, I was even saying, we cannot work. You dragged him here. He wasn't here out of his own free will, right? So it's very limited. I understand the well-meaning intention, but we need to look at the dynamic of the relationship in itself. What is it really based on? What's going on here, right? So again, really, in order to use a relationship for spiritual growth, both people need to be 100% committed to the relationship and to the growth and to their own individual process.
Yeah. And like, I feel a lot of the reasons why people stay in these relationships and try to make them work is because, first of all, they don't realize there's billions of people on the planet now. Like, you could easily find another relationship if you really want to, but it's the attachment that they're afraid to let go of. So they would rather work with what they have now, even if it's broken, than try and step into the unknown and work on themselves. And I've noticed, if you do enough self-work and I truly believe this, and you're in an unhealthy relationship, then there will come a point where it will get way too painful to be in that relationship. You know what I mean? Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So that's the thing. It's like, instead of trying to force your partner to get into stuff, work on yourself and then see where that takes you. I think that's a really important lesson for people because it's very common. I mean, you and I still do it sometimes, just blame the other person, for whatever it is you're feeling or experiencing. But until we're capable of constantly turning the mirror on ourselves, then we're also not committed to our own growth. That's the truth. Is like, it's really, and it's so easy to blame your partner because they're going to obviously remind you of all your unresolved issues with your parents, and it's going to trigger you and it's going to be your sore spots. But when we're trying to force the work on the other person, to me, that sounds, again, like trying to make them responsible for what we're experiencing. When we worked on our own experience, eventually it would become it would become very apparent that we either weren't meant to be with that person, or maybe we'd realize we were projecting on them. The latter is much more rare from what I've seen, but I've noticed that if you really work on your level of being, and this includes friendships too, not just romantic relationships, is that it will get you will not enjoy being around people who you used to enjoy being around before, because your level of being will change. You won't be able to relate to them in the same way.
Exactly. So on that note also, some relationships can be worked out, right? But again, the necessity is both people are truly committed.
Yeah.
And then you go beyond the ego personality, beyond the entitlement, beyond victim and blame, and taking full self-responsibility. And then, like I said, this can be amazing catalyst to elevate both on the high level of being and elevate the connection and actually experience deeper levels of love, higher levels of love. Because most often the quote-unquote love people experience in what I would call matrix relationships is very a vital kind of love, very conditional.
Yeah.
Almost like built on just passion, enjoyments, and not a deeper spiritual connection or psychic connection.
And you brought up a really good point in the beginning. When people first meet each other, they put on this facade and then it all breaks apart, which also indicates that if you're still getting into relationships from a false self, you haven't met your true self yet, because and that's a really important thing, is I feel, if you're single and you're listening to this, that's one thing to develop is your relation. Can you show up in the world and be authentically you and be unafraid of being that person? You know what I mean? And 95% of the people who I personally see in the world, it's not the case. So it's like, how can you enter into a true relationship if you don't even have a connection to your true self? It's not even possible,
Exactly. On that note, let's actually define what does it mean to be truly authentic, because I think there can be some confusion. Because some people can, I feel, even abuse the word, I'm just being authentic, by acting out their neurotic ego stuff, right? Of just being an asshole, basically.
It's like they think that being authentic is like letting their wounded inner child run the show in an egotistical way.
Yeah. Exactly. But being authentic means being aware of the inner wounded child, having that vulnerability, your feelings, your emotions, your inner life, right? Acting, and let that be your authentic, influence your authentic self, without pretending to be anybody else, right? And it also implies, most of us build an inauthentic, fake personality because we're very concerned what other people think of us. We compare ourselves, social image. We don't want to look weak in front of other people. So we suppress a lot of stuff. And that makes us, over time, very inauthentic. So authenticity is more also being in touch with your vulnerability, your wounded self, being aware, right? And also on a deeper level with your true essence that shines through, of just, not pretending, basically.
Yeah, and you get in touch with your true essence by, what's his name? A.H. Almas talks about essence in relation to holes. So anytime we develop a hole in our essence, we fill it with a false personality self. And that hole is made out of all our childhood traumas and wounds. So in order to actually retrieve more of your essence, you have to work on these basic childhood wounds that you have, and sometimes past lives, but definitely start with the childhood wounds first before you get into the past lives. But that's how you become your true self. So as you can see, it's easy to say, just be your true self. But in order to actually retrieve the true self, that's another story. So we just want to talk about also a little bit this true tantric relationship, because this neo-tantra movement has very distorted tantra, and the true tantric relationship is one person, and it takes commitment to that relationship and a foundation in spiritual practice, and that's it. So these like neo-tantra groups where it's like engaging as many people as possible. If you don't engage with this person, you have blockages. For me personally, I don't believe in that. It's not for me. Maybe it works for some people, but I feel one person is enough for me to learn from. And also the reason this is so that you can develop that depth and intimacy and go really deep with people, with a person. And the reason as to have the foundation in a spiritual practice, i.e. a meditative practice, is so that you can both be clear mirrors for each other. So I feel that, when we get involved with someone, it really needs to be, if we want to use a relationship for spiritual growth, yeah, we could get in polyamorous relationships, but I haven't personally seen that work out for people. It needs to be one person. And we need to also both have our own spiritual practice so that we can serve as clear mirrors for each other.
Yeah, let's even talk about real quick, define Tantra or Tantric relationship, because the worst thing that happened in the West, that literally Tantra is associated with sex, sexual energy.
Yeah.
Like it became a synonym. Right, similar like with shamanism equals ayahuasca medicine plants.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, that's like a very small fraction of shamanism, and even ancient shamanism, there was no medicine plants whatsoever. It's a way of life. So same with Tantra, it's not about finding sexual bliss or using orgasms to come closer to God or engage in sex magic. A lot of that is based on actually distortion or spiritualizing a lot of lower vital desires and all of that. So anyway, there has been just a lot of distortion. But what is a true tantric relationship?
True tantric relationship is like a deep devotion,
yeah.
Like deep commitment, deep devotion, and a foundation. And I'm actually not initiated in any tantric tradition, but this is what I've learned from my teacher, Reggie Ray, who he does teach true tantric relationships, and he talks about the tantric consort. So the tantric consort is like exactly the person who you're going to learn from the most. And they're also going to be the person who's going to trigger you the most. But see, then got to watch out, because this could also be distorted by people. It's like, oh, this abusive guy is triggering me. He must be my tantric consort. Totally not true. You both need to be committed to the relationship and be committed to your spiritual practice. And as a foundation in spiritual practices, like a practice that Reggie Ray teaches is called beholding the beloved, where, it has nothing to do with sex. It's just gazing at the other person's eyes for 11 or 31 minutes, or I think he says doing it in 20 minutes. And so, if you can do that with your partner, then you really get to witness them, and you get to really see who they really are. And through seeing who they really are, you understand who you really are.
Yeah. You think we should also mention that context when we talk about, both partners need to be committed and the growth and on all levels, because we need to work on our basic psychology, childhood wounding and shadows and all of that in order to connect more with our spiritual self, our higher self, our essence, and centered around the divine and all of that. But with regards to quote unquote, people may ask like, well, I can find a partner like this and all of that, there's nobody out there. But we also need to understand that whoever is in our lives, whatever relationship we have been to or in, there's a reason why they're in our lives, why we attracted them or we were attracted to them.
Yeah.
Right. So any relationship in our lives also engage, so to speak, as a mirror for where we are at.
Exactly.
Even our level of being, but without judgment. It's just the way it is, because you really need to get out of the blame. Mm-hmm. The blame. Too many people still like, if many people, myself included, you get involved with a very pathological partner, narcissist, whatever, borderline, whatever label you may get, sociopath, there's a reason why you attracted this person in life and why you actually was first attracted to them. And most of it is unconscious, very unconscious, based on trauma, childhood wounds, whatever, right? So it is taking that responsibility without blaming yourself, obviously, but taking responsibility and see like there's something to be learned from, because all these are lessons in relationship as well.
Yeah, and I don't think that for my own experience, the more that you're blaming the partners outside of you, the more work that you have to do. And this is what I did actually before we met, because I had, if you know anything about astrology, I had Pluto transiting my 7th house, and I still had it transiting my 7th house and this is a long transit because Pluto is a slow moving planet. So for years I was attracting karmic relationships that were mostly chaotic and filled with my own unconscious shit. So every time I met a partner that I had some, so say if I met someone who was really emotionally unavailable, I had to check myself. It's like, how emotionally available am I? Am I really ready for that relationship? And turn the mirror back on myself. And I think we've talked about this on a couple podcasts at least, but I see so often it's like, yeah, I got involved with a narcissist or a sociopath, but there doesn't seem to be much conversation about what it was in that person that attracted them to that relationship. It seems very like blame focused. Also, another thing I saw the other day, it was like a post on Facebook. It was like, what did it say? It was sociopaths and psychopaths taught me more about my spiritual growth and I could learn alone. And I was like, This is really important to note, that anything that you learn from a relationship with a narcissist or a sociopath was you learning it. It wasn't them teaching it to you. If they were teaching it to you, it's completely unconscious. So I feel like we give credit where it's not due when we say those kinds of things, you know, and they didn't mean to, if you're really in a relationship with a sociopath or a psychopath, they certainly did not mean to teach you a lesson for your spiritual growth. They tried to probably destroy you and your self-esteem based on your own wounding. So, you know, I see this a pattern a lot. Is like we kind of need to go, I don't know what it is, but people, maybe because they're more sensitive or empathic, but people on this spiritual path seem to be always have this initiation process, not always, but often, where they date a sociopath or a narcissist. And then the next stage is to break out of this stage where they're constantly talking about narcissists and sociopaths and whatnot, and then also turn the mirror on themselves and look at where they were wounded, and then just let it go too, like move on with your life. Why do you need to keep talking about it as well?
Yeah.
Because I think it really ties into, you know, the self-responsibility as well, which is a really important aspect for spiritual growth, is taking complete self-responsibility for what you have control of in the present moment. So if you're in a relationship that's very abusive, you need to take self-responsibility and not take self-responsibility for them abusing you. That's what they're doing. But look at what is it in you that feels that this is a safe relationship? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah. And okay, so if you do choose the wrong partner, what to do? I think we mentioned at the beginning of the podcast. So I feel at this point you have to make a choice. Are you committed to growth? Are you committed to the security of the relationship? Like, are you going to be committed to being authentic to how you're truly feeling? Or are you going to be committed to your attachment? And those are the difficult choices that we have to make, because I really want to touch on this, is the person that you choose as a partner is going to be the most important influence in your life. They're going to affect you in every single way that they can affect another person, especially when you're engaging sexually. You start taking on all sorts of energies from them. So this is really, you're choosing someone to be attached to you in so many ways. Yeah.
Exactly. I just want to interject. Very important. I mean, that's also, we could talk about this, but people don't understand for the most part, and I didn't either myself in the past, very ignorant, because we hadn't really educated at all about the power of sexual energy and the bonding that happened. You know, there's no such thing as casual sex. It doesn't exist. And, you know, whenever you have sex with somebody, even repeatedly, your auras, everything gets intermixed, your emotions, all of that on an etheric level, right? You literally take on parts of your partner more and more. That's why you become more sensitive to each other, even tune into each other more emotionally, psychically. So it's a very, very sacred act, right? And you can also take on stuff, you know, from your partner that he or she may be dealing with, you know. I mean, can tie into occult topics and entities and whatnot, but it is really, really, you know, again, what is the relationship based on? Because too many people in this day and age, they engage sexually way too quick, and when getting together with a person, even being in a relation, quote unquote, dating, right, without really knowing the person whatsoever. You know, so if you really a spiritual relationship based on, you know, it cannot be based on just on sexual connection alone. And that's what most quote unquote matrix relationships are based on. It's like this sexual attraction. And few people, if that's not happening anymore, they don't have sex, then it's like, oh my God, this, you know, they look for the next person where they can get that rush. But I don't want to, again, divert too much from what you just said. I just want to emphasize how, sex is just very much of a sacred act. And essentially in a spiritual relationship, it's even going beyond the sexual act itself, right? And transmuting the sexual energy to a higher, more refined expression, which expresses itself even beyond the act itself.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you kind of touched on something important, as somebody who goes from relationship to relationship is usually an avoidant attachment pattern. So avoidant attachment is someone who tends to, simply avoid relationships, but it's not necessarily true. They avoid commitment and intimacy in relationships. So they get into relationships, and then once it actually becomes committed, then they move on to the next partner. And then anxious people are the type of person who's like always waiting for a text back and, you know, constantly in their head about it. And anytime the person pulls away, the avoidant person tends to pull away a lot. The anxious person gets drawn closer. So even understanding what a secure, like this was a huge lesson for me, is understanding what a secure relationship looked like. And then when I met people, and by the way, majority of people in the dating market are actually going to be anxious or avoidant. That's why they're not secure. People who have secure attachment tend to get into relationships and stay in relationships. So the majority of the people out there are actually not, don't have healthy attachment patterns. That's why people are like, oh, there's no one out there or whatever, because they're rare. Because you also have to develop that within yourself as well. So I feel just even learning, goes back into what we're talking about, how basic psychology is so important. Learning what a secure relationship looks like is so important, and a safe relationship, because the thing that makes a relationship safe is someone who can calm your nervous system, who doesn't agitate your nervous system, doesn't put you into fight or flight. Because if you're living in an environment with someone who you feel like tense around, then that's just going to make you sick over time. Your nervous system is going to get shot, and that's also not going to help your own spiritual growth. And this is kind of leads into this idea, the safe relationship will help regulate you. And then, you know, the way that I see it is that we need to have some kind of baseline of security and calmness in our lives in order to grow spiritually. If we're in fight or flight survival mode, then we don't really have access to this higher knowledge and higher centers. So choosing the right partner who has some sort of secure attachment, and also, you know, has some understanding on their own being and nervous system and how they respond to events in their lives is really important, because this is someone whose nervous system we're going to be attuned to, especially if we're living together.
Yeah. You know, that reminds me of, like, in terms of choosing the right partner, right? Because as I said before, most of us, it's an unconscious choice based on unconscious attraction. And most often we also choose a partner, you know, because of this romantic attraction, which, you know, gets our heart pumping and we think of the person all the time. We get excited. In these emotional projections, that's how it's almost an unconscious choice. That's almost the biology working, right? And I remember, I don't know if it was Gurdjieff or A.H. Almas talking about it in terms of a relationship in an esoteric, quote unquote, context. You know, the more you are connected to your true self, the more you have healed within yourself or are aware, you know, when you have a true attraction to somebody, or somebody is actually a good match for, you know, where essence would match and not the personality, you know that? That was
Gurdjieff, I think.
Gurdjieff, yeah. Exactly. Then there's actually less of this romantic attraction, less of that excitement. There's just a sober recognition.
Yeah, romantic, that feeling, that kind of like heightened romantic attraction where suddenly this person comes in your life and you think that all of your problems are solved is actually a huge red flag, because that shows that your childhood wounding, your inner child is like, oh my God, someone's coming along and they're going to heal everything my parents did to me.
That's the irony. The more you have this romantic luge almost, so to speak, or experience of emotional high when meeting a person, the more, even from a basic Jungian perspective, the more there is shadow projection involved, right? The more projections are activated.
Yeah, and that's not necessarily the case that if you meet someone and there's romantic projections, don't get involved with them. I just noticed with our own relationship, I had to let those romantic projections almost burn themselves out and see what they were made of, so I could really get to know who you really were.
Yeah, that's a good point. It's not, because most experience this as well, but it's just being aware of it. And if both partners are aware of it, then again, you can use that as a catalyst for growth for both of them.
Exactly, because you can work through those projections.
Because you work through them, you own them, you take them back. And that entails also, when we talk about choosing a partner, you know, we mentioned before, both people are 100% committed to growth, but it also implies that each person needs to have a basic level of understanding, especially in this day and age. If you want to be in a conscious relationship, spiritual growth, and have all, you know, this conscious love, so to speak, you need to be aware of basic relationship psychology, basic how your old childhood stuff will, you know, be projected into a relationship. like these basics, psychological laws, so to speak. Yeah. I feel in anybody who is sincerely on the path towards quote unquote awakening, working on themselves, psychologically, spiritually, emotionally, on all levels, then naturally you will learn more about this and become more aware of it. So if you really, people always ask, where can I find this conscious partner? I say, well, you need to become that yourself.
Yeah.
The more you're sincere within yourself, apply the work, change, and through that inner work, change your level of being, change your quote unquote frequency, then you will also attract more that match naturally without needing to look for it.
Yeah, when we're looking for this perfect relationship, we need to also look at what we bring to the table as well. And I did this, and I think I don't know if I mentioned this earlier in the podcast, but every time I met someone who didn't have a quality that I was looking for, I turned the mirror back on myself and I was like, do I have that quality within myself? And then I read, I researched. I also had to just apply things. Sometimes it's really simple. Just reading something and applying it to your life is difficult and awkward it can be at first is really important. So if we learn, what avoidant attachment looks like and identify in an environment, we can also make that conscious choice in the moment. Be like, I'm not going to get involved with people who have these attachment patterns. And so that also comes down to our sincerity and taking full self-responsibility for the people that we're attracted to. And I think it's, instead of just getting into relationships because we're attracted to someone, I think this is also an aspect of spiritual growth, is more getting curious about why we're attracted to that person and kind of unpacking it in our mind and our being as well before we dive into it. Because I see so many people, they're like, oh, I'm attracted, I felt love from them. First of all, if you're making someone the source of love that you feel, it shows that you're disconnected from that love within yourself. So if you can only feel love when you're in a relationship, that also shows that you're disconnected from love. So you're looking for someone as a source of all that. So it's like any other addictive pattern, like Gabor Mate talks about, addiction as a way, so we make addiction, whatever we're addicted to, the source of some part of our essence that we've lost. So a lot of people, if they're looking for a relationship for security or safety, then at some point in their life, they lost that sense of security within themselves. If they're looking for a relationship for attention or love, then at some point in their life, they lost this attention and love for themselves. So anytime we need a partner in order to feel these qualities, actually just points to what we're missing within ourselves.
Yeah. And that's exactly, and that's almost the opposite of a relationship with the spiritual foundation, when you make your partner the source for your happiness and fulfillment.
Yeah.
Hence, a spiritual relationship for spiritual growth, what we mentioned before, also at the beginning, needs to have its foundation on the divine, right? And needs to be grounded, established in the divine, in God, whatever name you want to give that higher force, and each partner's individual relationship to the divine. That's the most important relationship. Because once you have this relationship to the divine, which means your relationship to essence, to your true self, then nobody in the outside world, including your partner, can take that away, can take away your own fulfillment, your own joy, your own happiness. Yeah. It doesn't depend on it. It doesn't mean that you don't, the partner can augment that and help you and make you feel more alive, but you don't depend on that. Yeah. Hence, it becomes more mature, more conscious, and using each other.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And I see it more, each partner, when they enter this kind of relationship, they become channels for that love. And then it's almost like your partner just becomes like a beautiful person who you can express that love that you feel for the divine to them. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So instead of looking, and it's more about giving, I've noticed, it's more about giving that love. A lot of us are looking to get into relationships to receive love and validation. But from what I've experienced, when you're connected to your true self, it's more about being able to give that love because you have so much overflowing in you.
Unconditional as well.
Yeah, exactly. I know. So before we met, I remember feeling just pure, especially spending so much time in nature. I was living very secluded. And I would just feel like pure love for like the plants and the animals and also everyone around me. And I knew that I was just channeling something higher. So anyone who arrived in my life, and this also leads into being discerning, I could see qualities that I liked in them, you know? And I think that's also a really good indication that we are connected to our true self. Instead of seeing differences in another person, we can see one part of them that we see a similarity with. And we start literally seeing the world through God's eyes. And so the more that we're looking at partners, and there's a difference between like discernment and being like too critical. It's like, oh, I don't want to be with them because of this and this and this and this. And we're kind of constantly criticizing other people. That's also shows
exactly. Can I say just something on that?
Yeah.
Because that's also like, you know, people say it's kind of tricky, that topic, in the sense because, you know, when you have certain standards, right? And you have deal breakers.
Yeah.
But some of these standards is based on like having this image of a dream partner, right? And I remember like there's an excellent book out there which I've quoted from before in my articles. I can highly recommend this book. It's called How to Be an Adult in Relationships by David Rico. And in this book he says something, I'm paraphrasing him. He says, as long as you're looking for a dream partner, you know, as long as you have an image of a dream partner, it's an indication to do work, to have to do some serious work on yourself.
Yeah.
Right? Because you're projecting some ideal outside yourself of something that may fulfill you. Right.
And those positive projections, even though maybe at first we get off on the high of them, they're actually a disservice to the person that's in front of you and you're trying to get to know, because you're overlaying this godlike, you know, you're putting them on this pedestal instead of getting to know who they really are. And for me, true love is not some perfect person. It's being able to love someone, you know, through their challenges and through the things that they're trying to work on. That's also how you support each other's spiritual growth. And the more that you expect your partner to be perfect, the more you're also don't understand what it means to truly spiritual grow, because it's also through your imperfections that you really, I mean, paradoxically start to understand your own perfection.
Yeah, and that's a good point with positive shadow projection, because it happens, you literally, and positive shadow projection combined with not having a spiritual foundation, not a personal, your own spiritual practice in or relationship to the divine, you make the partner into the image of God, like, which is supposed to fulfill everything. This putting the partner on the pedestal, like feeling all these amazing things for him or her, but then sooner or later it will all crumble. Right, the house of cards will topple, the illusion will topple. It's all just based on projection. Then usually it turns the opposite. It turns a negative shadow projection, and the so-called love turns into resentment and hate and all of that. And now, ironically, we've even experienced it in our work. Some people also positively project on us, positive shadow projection, right? And then we do say something which triggers people, and then it turns around and we get projected on negatively, right? That happens in everyday life as well, but it's really important to being aware of shadow projection. You know, not just negative, but positive.
Yeah, and that kind of leads also when we have these like high emotions when we're in relationships. It also proves that our addiction might be in relationships, because if we see a relationship as being a sense of like euphoria and all of the qualities that we look for in drugs, and usually our addictions are relationships. And so there's two types of people, usually people who are addicted to relationships and who are overly relationship phobic. And sometimes there's people who need to take time alone and just build the container around themselves and be alone. But sometimes we're using it as a way to strengthen our denial, because we can't really see ourselves until we see ourselves and how other people respond to us. So through the mirror of a relationship. So we don't really understand ourselves unless we have people around to mirror us, you know, either consciously or subconsciously. So people who tend to be relationship phobic, I also feel, going back to the title, is like, are you truly committed to spiritual growth? Because that's when you really get to know what kind of person you are, is when you show up in a relationship and you start learning through the mirror of relationship and how other people are responding to you as well. So, you know, the relationship addiction and relationship phobia are almost like two sides of the same coin. Like one person, they're both in denial, and they're both also avoiding true intimacy because they're just addicted to the chemicals and
to the rush.
Exactly, which also just proves that they don't have the connection to the divine and, to life force within themselves, and they need the relationship.
Or
for
addicted,
that.
people who are addicted to relationship, jumping from relationship to relationship is also avoidance to facing themselves.
Yeah.
And essentially. But ironically, that's also the case for people who are relationship phobic. We're also endlessly waiting because, and I've noticed people who are relationship phobic or also in a sense neurotically always a bit in victim and self-pity. They can't find the right person and there's no one, and even no one out there. And even sometimes it turns into like even what's coming through unconsciously or consciously, some really like resentment for the opposite sex.
Yeah.
Right. And I have to say, generally speaking, I see it especially with women nowadays. All men suck. There's nobody out there anyway. I'm going to be just single for the rest, and even take pride in that. But it's like a wounded ego response, actually.
Yeah, exactly. And that's another thing. I mean, I had to work through that personally, is because I had, like issues with my own father and masculine figures in my life. And you have to have a healthy relationship also, not only with your own, with masculine people in your life. If you're a woman or if you're, gay, obviously it's going to be different, but whoever the sex is that you're attracted to and the essence within them, you need to have a healthy relationship with that within yourself. And also, because on a basic level, it's like working through all your past relationships, I feel, is a really good. I meet so many people who are like, oh, I'm ready for a conscious relationship, but my ex is such a dick or whatever, and they haven't really cleared out the karma, I guess you could say, of their past relationships. And they just want to get into another relationship because they just need to almost fill that hole within them, So anytime you have any, of course, maybe your relationships in the past weren't perfect and you probably don't want to be a part of some of their lives. That's one thing. But if you're holding any resentment towards them, that's also a sign that there's more healing work to do, because whatever resentment you're also projecting on a past partner, I guarantee you 9 times out of 10 has to do with your early childhood, and more stuff to look at there as well. So it also kind of leads into both partners have this foundation in self-work before they get into a relationship, because this is like the toolbox that you arrive to the relationship with. So if you arrive to a relationship without, for instance, understanding positive shadow projection and shadow projection, then you're going to just get into the relationship in chaos, and also just a basic self-understanding. So self-reflection, self-inquiry. So someone, learning how to work with triggers, and also, learning how to work with what comes up in the relationship, because what I've noticed is, you can learn a lot of new skills when you're in a relationship, but each partner brings their own toolbox to the relationship. So you have to look at like the tools you have for managing, especially difficulties in a relationship, when you arrive to the relationship. And you can even test this out before you meet someone and when you're single, because you can apply these tools to any relationship in your life, not just a romantic relationship as well. And that really will help the other partner too, because it's especially when conflict happens, when triggers come up, like that's when you're going to get into your wounded child self, and all your stuff is going to get activated. And I guarantee you, especially if you're going into a relationship for spiritual growth, these are the things that have to come up as well. So these tools that you have are going to be the saving grace in your relationship, literally, because this is the stuff, if you don't deal with it as it comes up and do what they call relationship psychology, like a proper repair, meaning this is also an important aspect of using relationships to spiritual growth. So after a conflict happens, you're able to repair with the person, like truly repair the conflict, not push it under a rug, not let time heal it, but truly repair and find where the misunderstanding was, reconnect, find a way to repair the bond. And this is what your tools are going to be able to provide you with, because what I see in my relationships and a lot of relationships is these little resentments that build up over time. It's like, it creates this backlog. And then every single fight is like a compilation of all the fights from the past. And then eventually that gets to a breaking point. So these tools and ability to repair after conflict are so important.
Yeah. I've also noticed that, and the more you're actually sincere in that process as individuals, the more heightened these issues will come. So the less you're able to hide from each other.
Yeah.
Because the higher level you're being, the less you're able to lie to yourself, the less you're able to suppress, the more every little thing comes apparent as a way to confront and transmute. right? To a higher level of being. And there's also, as a foundation of the spiritual foundation besides having this connection to the divine and God. And listeners may ask you, what is divine God? What do you mean by that relationship? Well, that's something for you to contemplate. And we actually had a podcast episode recently on that topic called "What is your relationship to the divine?" And I encourage anybody who hasn't listened to that to check that out. But it also implies that there needs to be, like we mentioned at the beginning, both very committed to the growth, having this foundation, and having this collinearity. There's a saying, love is from The Little Prince, I think, or the author of The Little Prince. Love is not about looking into each other's eyes, but looking into the same direction. Right. And that's what an evolutionary love relationship with the foundation and divine is also about. It's not about escaping into this private sphere of our pleasure and just enjoyment for a couple, right, in this romantic bliss bubble, but, doing the greater work here, right? And collinearity doesn't mean that both persons are the same. They have their own individual, but the same aim, right? And also doing the greater work for the collective. There's something bigger. That relationship is not an escape from the world, right? Yeah. But helps to engage more in the world and helps to inspire each other in terms of their vocation, the work each of them or together are doing out in the world.
Yeah, and that's also brings us back to what you mentioned earlier in the podcast about this safe relationship. Like if you have, I even notice when, because we've been doing long distance for a while up until now, basically, and every time that I am around you, my nervous system relaxes and it allows higher levels of creativity, higher levels of work to occur. And so that's the gift that we have to provide the world. If you think about it too, I'm sure people did this, but if you wanted to do meditation somewhere in nature, people did it. But if you had people around to watch you and watch your back, you could progress further on the spiritual path because you would feel that safety and security of your community. And I feel also as well, if we had the safety of a relationship, it allows this higher wisdom and higher path to open up for us because we're not just focused on this basic survival and acting out, the karma of our ancestors over and over again. There's so many patterns that are, I feel we need to break a lot of our ancestral patterns, many of us right now, because the relationship that we're trying to create on this planet currently, I feel, especially people who are involved in spiritual work, I don't feel has existed and has a possibility to have existed any time before in history, because even if you look at your grandparents, my grandparents, I know, it was mostly security. My grandmother, very young, knew she needed to have a man in order to even own property back then, most likely. So it was basically security based. And, so that was the foundation of the relationship, and the emotional compatibility was not there. And then this also, we're going to get more into this in the second hour of the podcast, but before we met, someone told me that I needed to meet someone who I connected with on all levels. So that was emotionally, mentally, spiritually, and physically. And so all of those four factors in the past in relationships weren't possible because it was mostly survival based. And if it's not, and now what I've noticed in people is because their ancestors were so survival based in choosing partners, all of their pathologies and all of their wounds also carried over, even though in this present moment, it's not the case anymore. So, it's with all the issues that I've seen with projection and feminism has also equalized things a little bit. Like now women can own property. They can own, they don't have to get into a relationship purely for survival, but that psychology is still there. So you still have people getting into relationships with a sense of codependency. And I think that's, like, in my experience, that needs to be completely abolished, basically, the codependency, because it's like interdependency. It's like, I support you, you support me, but we can also be individuals as well.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I experience in our relationship as well. It's not, there's a safety, but it's not that we depend on each other, and there's like, this codependency, which, I've definitely experienced in past relationships. And I also, like, on that note, even like when I look back 10, 15 years ago, we all want this perfect relationship, the ideal partner. But I'm looking back, I wasn't even close, ready to be in the relationship I am in with you now. Like, even though I thought I wanted that, you know what I mean? Like, I can see how I was just completely like projecting and not seeing myself clearly, very immature in that sense, So, but, can see with our relationship, I think, since we're at the end of the first hour, let's talk about more of our own personal experiences.
Yeah, in the second hour. Exactly. And I just want to also note, I'm sure anyone who's listening to this is also interested in relationships and spiritual growth, is you also can't force a conscious relationship. Oh, no. So I see that so often. It's like, oh, this is what a conscious man looks like. This is what a conscious woman looks like. And then people try and emulate themselves to be that. And then they try and it's almost like this facade of forcing a conscious relationship. And you have so many people who...
What was these articles were out there going around for a while? What a conscious woman wants in a relationship, or a conscious man should do in the relationship. These are it's a very, that doesn't even make sense. Yeah. The titles already.
Yeah.
Right?
But anytime you're also trying to force something also is an indicator that something's not quite right. Because I know, and we're going to lead into this in the second hour, is that somewhat paradoxically, before you get into a relationship, you also have to give up this idea of having a relationship. So, except if you're truly, the divine is the most important relationship in your life, you also have to give it up to the divine and ask, is relationship part of my own soul purpose and part of my own growth? And for some people, it may not be. And that doesn't mean that there's anything wrong with them. It just means that, and it also means that you will actually find true happiness in not being in a relationship. So we have to, in order to give our life and surrender up to the divine, we also have to give up the relationship, because anytime we still feel that desperation for a relationship, it also means that there's something missing within us, and means we haven't truly surrendered as well.
Which it goes back to what people are truly looking when they're looking desperately for their partner, some fulfillment outside themselves. A relationship is actually looking for God, for their own essence, for the true selves, right? So again, it goes back to that foundation, and I know for myself, that was initiated, made me to be ready in the relationship I'm with you right now, was my search for God, of really surrendering to the divine, of all that entails. And it's not an easy process, because when you surrender, it brings up everything you avoid that's in the way of that surrender, so to speak, right?
Yeah.
So... and I also wanted to note, the irony of a conscious relationship, it brings up all the unconscious stuff in a conscious. The only difference in a conscious relationship, if both partners are compatible and aware and work with that foundation and commitment for growth, you can use it as a catalyst. It's an alchemical, sacred container that can, transmute all the shadow into light. Mm-hmm. But the unconscious stuff will come up in a conscious relationship.
Yeah.
That's the irony in it all.
Yeah.
So
usually right in the beginning.
That's exactly, especially at the beginning.
Yeah. So
what are we talking in the second hour?
Yeah. So we're going to go deeper into this choosing a partner who you align with on all levels. What does that mean? And how do you even do that? And really, I'd like to share our own past before we met. So this includes our past relationships and lessons and what we had to learn before we got together. And I mean, for me, I know it was even in early, I think in 2013, maybe it was even earlier that, there's a point where I was I need to work on relationships. And it was years of working, 6 years before we met. Or when did we meet? 2018? I forget. Anyway, it was years of working on myself and also getting involved with the wrong people before I was and then I gave up a relationship and then we met. So I want to go in deeper into that story. And also what we kind of touched on is healing trauma in relationships, because relationships for spiritual growth, it can be an amazing catalyst for healing trauma as well. And this is through safe relationships, also embracing conflict in relationships. And a really big topic is how occult forces and interferences can come in these relationships that want to be born, because these are also tests as well, is tests to the relationship and tests to our own sincerity. And anyone who's been listening to our podcast, for anyone who's new, these occult forces are exactly what tests the sincerity of the spiritual seeker as well.
Exactly. And I also want to, on that note, I want to also address on the topic of occult forces. Again, it's a whole, it ties into the topic as well, but there's a huge difference between occult for entity interferences and entity attachments. Yeah. And I can talk about this in the context of relationships as well.
Yeah. And then the last point we can really talk about a little bit more, excuse me, is relationships and service. So using your relationship and your partnership to be of better service to the world. So
Right.
we hope you listen to the, excuse me, you're going to have to close this. I'm coughing.
So yeah, the second hour again for the members of the Piercing the Veil of Reality community. If you're not a member already, you can sign up at veilofreality.com. The membership gives you access to all the podcast second hours and also to the monthly Zoom group call we have with our community, and obviously as well for the forum. And there's a lot of activity happening on the membership forum as well. So yes, you can sign up at veilofreality.com. See you on the second hour.